Well, welcome back to our study of First Peter as we read through Romans to Revelation. We find ourselves in First Peter chapter 2. If you remember from our introduction to Peter, we know this book is about suffering. It's the suffering of Christians under the hands of both their communities and the authorities. Chapter 1 and 2 start out with talking about salvation. So we learn from that one of the ways to prepare for suffering is to be really firmly rooted and grounded in your salvation. Then beginning in chapter 2, verse about 11 through chapter 4 or chapter 3, we see a discussion about submission, which is very surprising. I'll talk about that in a moment here. The last thing you would think about if you're being persecuted by your neighbors or your government is submission. But Paul calls them, or Peter calls them, to submission. And then the last part of the book is about the suffering itself. So let's dive in today in chapter 2. Two main sections here, verses 1 through 3, and then verses 4 through 10. And I'll take those verses 4 through 10 and divide those up a little bit. But in chapter 2 here, we're first told to, it begins with so in my Bible, so or therefore. So what he's saying is because you have been purified by the word, that is, you have placed faith in the message that you heard preached to you. We can see that at the very last sentence in chapter 1. It says, and this word is the good news that was preached to you. So, in other words, since you've received that word, since you've believed, verses 1 through 3 say, don't fight among yourselves. This is very important when the church is under duress, church is under attack, that we not fight among ourselves, but rather he gives us an alternative here. Cling to the word. Cling to the word. I love what he says, like newborn children. Love what he says in verse 3. If indeed, that is, you'll do this, that you'll cling to the word as a newborn baby clings to his mother's breast, you're going to cling to the word if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. In other words, unity in the face of adversity is true spirituality. Let me say that again. Unity in the face of adversity is true spirituality. Now, I know, brothers and sisters, that there are times when we have to have theological debates. We have to have profound disagreements and perhaps sometimes even separation when there are theological disagreements among the brothers. But that is more rare than it seems to be sometimes. I think a lot of times we divide over secondary issues or over issues with regard to tastes or preference rather than core substantive issues of the Christian faith. And we need, especially as we see the world closing in on us and we understand what the church, what the conditions are going to be in the last days, that we need to come together and find more commonality than we'll find excuse for separation. In other words, we need to focus on what we believe in common and less on what separates us if we're going to stand firm in the face of a culture that is more and more turning against us. So if we go on here, it talks about the unity of the word, and then in verses 4 through 10, the confidence of the word. So notice how this is really centered around the word. In verses 4 through 6, Peter talks about the recipients of the letter being built into a spiritual house, the priesthood, giving sacrifices, that they're not going to be put to shame. The perseverance is a suffering. Perseverance is in suffering is a ministry actually to the world and will be rewarded. I think that's the main theme there in verses 4 through 6. This talk about priesthood and sacrifices and built into a spiritual house. This is all reminiscent, echoing Old Testament ministry of Israel to the world. And the church has not replaced Israel, but the church is now God's representative to the world during this period of time. So our perseverance in suffering is really a supernatural sign to the world of the quality of our faith, and it will be rewarded. Verses 7 to 8 then says, So, honor, let me see, let me turn to that in my Bible. So honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, this honor, I couldn't read my own handwriting there. So honor is not to be, is going to be given to those who suffer for suffering, or suffer for perseverance in suffering. Honor is going to be given to those who are faithful to the Lord even through suffering. The others are going to stumble over Christ. And it says this is what they were destined for. Well, they're destined to it in the sense that all humanity was lost in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam fell. Romans 5 verses 12 through 21 make it very clear that because of Adam's sin, that sin has been imputed to all mankind. So apart from Christ and God's gracious intervention, from Adam on, all mankind is heading for conscious eternal torment in hell. It's only the intervention of God through Christ and the Spirit that anyone is saved. Some point to this, and Calvin did, looked at this as a text that supports double predestination, that God has predestined some to destruction and some to salvation. Well, I'd say that this is not a verse that supports that, because all men were destined for destruction. All men were destined to hell. God has predestined some to salvation. He has selected some to salvation, and they will be saved. Puts wind in our sails when it comes to evangelism, knowing that there are people out there that God has designated for salvation. But all the unsaved are destined to eternal conscious torment in hell, and ultimately they will be the ones who are bringing persecution against God's faithful ones. Verses 9 to 10 then picks up this theme of that Peter's readers are not the kind of people who fall away. They don't shrink back in suffering. They're not the lost. They're not those destined for hell. He calls them, but you, in contrast to those who are destined to disbelief, he says they are chosen, they are royal, they are holy, they are at his own. I want you to point out here that our brothers and sisters who advocate what's known as a replacement theology, that the church has replaced Israel, sometimes point to this verse and say, here's evidence of it, but it says nowhere here that the church replaces Israel. It uses the same sort of imagery and offices and ministry that Israel had in their day, but it doesn't say that the church has replaced Israel, rather that God is working through the church to reveal himself as he revealed himself through Israel. So that closes this section where Peter is emphasizing our salvation. The big idea here is that we are saved in Christ and set apart for him and by him. And like Christ, we should expect to suffer. Since we are Christ and we have identified with him, we should expect to suffer, but our salvation is sure. Now Peter's going to talk about submission. Verses 11 through 12, he talks about submission to each other. This kind of revisits the theme that he started in chapter 2, that we are to be arguing among one another. We're supposed to put away all malice and hypocrisy and deceit. So here he talks about how we are supposed to be abstaining from passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep our conduct among the Gentiles honorable. So he's talking about here how we treat each other, that we are to treat each other in a way and with such respect that the Gentiles even notice it. Verses 13 through 17, he says, surprisingly, submit to the government for the Lord's sake. Not for the sake of the government, or even for the sake of the culture that the government rules over, or the country that the government rules over, but for the Lord's sake. Who is government? The Caesar at this time. Who's the head of the government? Well, no other than that pernicious, probably demon-possessed man that we know as Nero, who was a great persecutor of the church. This is why Peter had to write at this time. Raises the question here, are we supposed to submit to every government, no matter what they do? Let me point out in verse 14 that Peter characterizes a government to submit to as one that punishes those who do evil and praise those who do good. In verse 15, he says that we are to be by doing good, we put to silence those who want to persecute us. In verse 17, he says, honor everyone. And he closes that same verse by saying, honor the emperor. Verse 19, he makes the point that unjust suffering is Christ-like. So let me say, first of all, that governments in the Bible are always evil. They are always evil. But that doesn't give us carte blanche to rebel against governments. We rebel and resist when a government asks us to do something that is clearly against God's word. Let me give you a couple of references here. I'm running out of time, so you might want to look them up. But Matthew 22:21, where Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Acts 4:19 says, should we listen to you rather than listen to God? And then chapter 5 of Acts, verse 29, where the disciples ask, are we to obey God and not men? They say they must obey God and not men. So there are times when we need to resist an evil government, but other times when we should not. And that takes discernment, and that takes care, and that takes reading of the word. So I encourage you to do that. He talks about servants being submissive to their masters in verses 18 through 25. And again, we see here that unjust suffering is going to happen. The question is how do we respond? How do we respond to that unjust suffering? When it comes to from the hands of a government, as far as possible, we are to treat them with honor and respect. When it comes from the hands of an unjust master of a slave, the slave is to again treat the master with as much justice and respect as possible. This is our witness to the world. This sort of supernatural submission is a sign of the supernatural source of our faith. Yet, brothers and sisters, we're all called at some point to obey God rather than men. And in a lot of cases, I think that time has come in some areas. So I pray for discernment for you and for me as we navigate a world that is turning more and more against Christianity, specifically, or faith in general, and that we have the strength to stand firm and the discernment to stand firm when we should. A couple of principles here I'll leave you with as we close this out. First, we are called to endure suffering as a witness of the source of our faith and a witness to its supernatural quality. Suffering is going to come into our lives. It's going to happen. It's God ordained. And how we react to that suffering is a witness to its supernatural, our faith's supernatural origin and source. And while called to submission and even called to suffering, there are times that we must submit. So I pray that you look at these verses that I referenced. Maybe we'll do another video just specifically on our relationship to the government. But it's clear that there are times that we need to resist the government. And I pray again for myself and for you that we have the biblical wisdom and knowledge and discernment to know when those times come. God bless you, brothers and sisters.